Introducing the final session of today's Reverse Select Committee. This panel is looking at infrastructure and economics, and we have before us to give evidence to the panel three chairs. Debbie Abrahams, who's the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee and is well known to Evidence Week in Parliament. Lord Moylan, who is chair of the Lords Built Environment Select Committee, and Yuan, who is member of the Treasury Select Committee, who stepped in. Thank you very much for joining us today. I have to remind you again, this is being broadcast on Parliament TV. It's being live streamed, but we are not protected by parliamentary privilege, so no slander from the witnesses, please, today. I move to our first question, which is from Lily Thurston from London, from the Child Poverty Action Group.
The Child Poverty Action Group's youth panel, that I'm a member of, brings together young people from across London. We explore how poverty is having an impact on young people, as well as offering first-hand insights, given that our panel includes young people with lived experiences of poverty. The government's own data shows that 4.3 million children are currently growing up in poverty in the UK. How is this evidence, along with the work of the Child Poverty Task Force, being used by the Treasury to reduce child poverty?
Yuan, there's a lot in that question. Can I throw that in your direction?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and thank you for raising such, or thanks to your member for raising such an important question to the whole panel. So the Treasury will look at assessments of child poverty and response to child poverty on two different levels, both the micro and the macro. And within those different levels is also the consideration of regional inequality, which I know my colleague Debbie Abrahams has worked on a lot in her time here as well as how to address the regional disparities that occur. I think if you were to look at this issue from the point of view of, very broadly speaking, household costs and household incomes, on the income side of the ledger, as it were, the Treasury looks at a range of, for example, regional interventions from jobs and employment plans and industrial strategy, which will hopefully lessen regional inequality over the long run, also down to the micro of who is getting into employment, the necessity, for example, for getting women who, since the pandemic, have disproportionately had to leave their professions and be part-time employed or unemployed in order to take care or full-time care of vulnerable people in their household who would need care, and so on. So that's just to demonstrate the kind of scale of levels that's addressed on. I think the other consideration from the Treasury's point of view when it allocates departmental funding on child poverty alleviation programs is whether those departments have the capacity in their departments as they are fit right now to deliver those projects on the scale that's needed. So I hope that gives us a flavour, although obviously not a complete answer to such a rich and important question.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to keep all contributions very brief, and
okay.
We have many questions to come to you, Debbie Abrahams, but I will give you a minute on this because I know it's very close to your work.
Absolutely. So what I wanted to mention is both the Education Select Committee and the Work and Pensions Select Committee are going to be undertaking a joint inquiry on this as the child poverty strategy is developed. But from my former background as a public health consultant, I just need to say in terms of the evidence, the impact on child poverty and also on the inequalities of child poverty, how it varies within different income groups, has a lifelong effect. It affects the development of a child, including the plasticity of their brains. And if we are serious about wanting to reach develop our growth potential and our potential as a country as a whole, we need to recognise the really limiting impacts of child poverty and take serious action.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily, for your question. Now we're moving on to a different subject. We had a lot of questions about rural transport, bus routes, how those kinds of decisions are made and what sort of role Parliament plays in looking at the impact of those on society, such as whether people can access their medical appointments, socialise, do exercise, and that kind of thing. And I know at Money Saving Expert that was a common theme for many of your questioners.
Yes, absolutely. I'm Katie Watson from Money Saving Expert with questions for Lord Moylan from Michelle Brideau, who is an avid cyclist from Gloucester and also an MSc user. What routes do committees have to review and question calculations in government transport policies, such as how they factor in the benefits from spending money on active transport like cycling for the NHS and environmental targets?
Well, it is a subject which any committee that's related to government expenditure can certainly take up and pursue if it wishes in detail. And the basic feature, I think, is that for capital projects, the Treasury has a process of assessing whether they constitute value for money, how much value for money they generate. It's contained in a document known as the Green Book. It's a highly controversial document because it has to quantify not only money in and money out, cash in and cash out, but also certain other benefits and disbenefits that can arise from a project, which are much more difficult to quantify, but it has to quantify them somehow or other in order to produce a result. And there are calls from time to time for the Green Book methodology to be revised. That goes for capital projects. Then if the government is changing expenditure, it's deciding to spend more money on, let us say, cancer services in the NHS or less money on something maybe, then it will produce an impact assessment which will try to assess what you're actually getting from costs. The great bulk of public expenditure, however, and this is why it's such an interesting question, is recurring expenditure. It's money that the government has spent every year, or it's money that it doesn't involve change. It just involves carrying on doing what you've been doing before. Or it's expenditure which the government can't strictly control in that it pays pensions or welfare benefits. It's demand-led. And there's no real impact assessment ever done, I think, of, should we carry on paying pensions? I don't think anyone's ever asked that question. So perhaps that's a really good question that people should be asking, given that it covers the bulk of expenditure. I'll stop there, but we can come back specifically to the transport issues if you like.
Thank you. Actually, I'll move at this moment then, I think, to a question from Marcus Lawson, who is a father from Cardiff.
Thank you. I recently became a father, and I'm just shocked by the disparity in support for new mothers and fathers. What evidence is used to determine this, and why is paternity entitlement so much less than maternity, given the evidence shows that longer entitlement will be positive for families?
Well, first of all, congratulations, and I hope everything's going well. To be honest, I think this is one of the areas that is more around policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. So you use evidence to suit the policy at the time. There's, again, so much evidence about how important it is for children, newborn children, to develop attachment. There's obviously a particular need for mothers as things have evolved because of breastfeeding and so on, and that has very much driven policy in the past, but it's also about social policy in terms of the society believing that the mother has the main caring responsibility. And I think it's absolutely right that we do have shared parental leave now.
Debbie Evans, can I just stop you there? Because
Sure.
we actually did have a question also about this from a mother's perspective.
Sure.
So I think take that as well at the same time, so you can wrap your response
Sure.
up to all of those.
Yes, MSc user Fiona Heels from Edinburgh. She asked, how is the suitability of the current level of statutory maternity pay and statutory paternity pay assessed? What evidence has been used to justify the disparity between the current level of statutory MAT and PAT pay and the national living wage?
To be honest, I don't know. And I'm being absolutely honest, I can compare when I had my children in the late 80s and the relative value of the maternity pay that I had. There was no paternity pay whatsoever, no paternity leave. I think very little was taken into account there, and yet at the same time I was aware from the work I was doing around this field how Norway, for example, was providing at least a year. That was equivalent times, but at least a year in terms of parental leave. So I think the evidence, as I said, was more around policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. And we know the benefits, as I say, from having both parents engaged in the early start of a child's life, let alone the benefits to the parents themselves as well. So it's how we decide whether we're going to prioritise, whether it is important for both parents to have that and what we can do about that. I still believe there's a massive gap, even though we've had parental leave, we haven't had, or paternity leave rather, we haven't had the uptake that we had hoped that we would see. And I think we need to work more on that.
Thank you. And both of your committees, I mean, this is a subject that affects many, many constituents. Presumably you are open to review it and keep this under review.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And to add to what Debbie has already said, there's a first order assessment of the costs of maternity and paternity pay that will take into account, for example, the costs borne by the employer and the costs borne by the Department for Work and Pensions or by the government more broadly. However, as we've all amply discussed, there are many more second and third order effects of having kind of well-supported parents being able to support their children at such a crucial time in their lives, and that creates a broader social value, which also comes into consideration when the Treasury makes its assessments. And Lloyd Moylan is right to say that sometimes those assessments can be controversial, and they should definitely be open to updating.
Yeah, I just wanted to. We also had a question from Abby Bell, who was trying to make it here from Hartlepool to ask her question today. That was about the government's calculation that personal independence payments claims will double within 4 years, and does the evidence explain this? So, can I put that to you both for a very brief answer? Are you looking for the explanation behind these sorts of statements as committee chairs, members?
Absolutely, and first of all, I think there is quite significant evidence already. People will be aware of Professor Sir Michael Marmot and the work that he did, first of all in the 2000, the Fairer Lives report, and then his monitoring of that. And he showed back in 2017 that the UK, along with the US, we were starting to see a flatlining of life expectancy. By the beginning of 2020, we were actually seeing a decline in life expectancy for deprived areas and for women. That's before the pandemic. We were already seeing poor health. And his calculation last year was in terms of the impact of certain programs, austerity programs, on excess mortality. You don't necessarily have somebody dropping down dead. You have a period of healthy life expectancy, and that has also been declining. So you have a shorter time when you are living in good health. So that would contribute to the additional demands around incapacity benefit, not PIP. PIP is an additional costs benefit for the extra, as I say, the extra costs that disabled people experience as a result of their impairment or disability.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. It's perhaps worth recognising that a lot of the questions that Mumsnet, Money Saving Expert and others, and certainly that we had, was about what are the calculations behind statements the government makes, and if Parliament doesn't look for them, if select committees don't look for them, then how else are we going to get our hands on them? I think lots of our questions were about, what's behind this, very much so. We have a question, also our final question from Money Saving Expert. You had another question from Gregory Hastings.
Yes, I think this is for you actually, Yuan. Gregory is a paramedic from Preston, and he says, how is budget forecasting used to project costings, and why does it often seem to go over budget? For example, HS2, aircraft carriers, other large infrastructure projects.
That's a very good and very big question. So by budget forecasting, I think we're talking about the forecasts of specific infrastructure, in this case projects, rather than the forecasting of the the
general
budget overall, which is another question. To be fair, also to the previous government, of course, of which I was not a part as a new MP, when there are huge supply chain shocks, as there were during the pandemic, that leads to a rise in prices across the board that can really affect and put those projects out of whack. And I think it's probably fair to say that inflation is quite difficult to predict. Central banks and all sorts of kind of commercial forecasters can get it wrong all the time. The role of the government to forecast inflation over a very long period of time, as infrastructure projects can often go on for in the scale of decades, can be quite difficult. At the same time, though, the government also has inflation-linked assets and liabilities that it can buy or sell to try to hedge some of that inflation risk. But by and large, the longer the project can go on for, the more there will be unforeseen shocks of that kind. I'm not an expert, I'm afraid, on HS2, but there's also a question, I think, of delivery there, which I don't know if Lord Moylan...
And perhaps we can emphasise the question was about why they always seem to go over budget. So the forecasting is always wrong in one direction. They never seem to come in under budget.
I think there's also a question about attention bias there, because it's very rare that you see headlines. I used to be a journalist before I was a MP. You very rarely see headlines saying that a project is under budget.
I think there's something more fundamental going on than simply inflation and shocks. When a politician comes up with a proposal for a new railway or something like that, they have to attach some sort of costing to it just when they announce it, I'm going to build a railway from here to here. We'll stick with railways as an example, but it could be something else. I'm going to build a railway from here to here. Well, that's great. Unless you put a number to it, it lacks reality. But you can't put a number to it. You can't realistically put a number to it. It's crazy. What is it? What was HS2 when it was first proposed? I remember when it was first proposed. What was it? It was a line on a map. What's a line on a map cost you? What's the cost of building a line on a map? Nobody knows what the actual cost is going to be. In order to do any project, even if it was, say, you decided to build your own house, in order to do any project, to be able to cost it effectively, you have to do layers and layers of repetitive work, going through various well-defined stages of design. They're called rebirth stages, but it doesn't matter what they're called. As you take the design further and further forward, and at each stage, you can refine the costing much more precisely. And so to say in advance what something is going to cost gives a level of assurance which actually nobody is entitled to offer. It's a finger in the air. It's not a stupid thing. It should cost us so many £1 million to build a mile of railway. So multiply that by the amount of railway you're building, and you get a sort of rough cost. But that is just the beginning of where you need to be. To get the exact cost, you need to be much further down the road. But people buy into these early costs as if they were somehow fixed in stone, and everything else later is an overrun, it's a scandal, and so forth. You're making statements and claims that you don't have the evidence for, largely. There is, in addition, not just what Yang Ying calls the attention bias, there is a well-recognised, and it's actually built into the Green Book, there is a well-recognised tendency to what's called optimism bias, which is that if you're actually promoting it, or the engineers behind it, you always tend to think it'll be cheaper than it's going to be. The Treasury recognises that by actually increasing whatever you say, they increase it by a certain amount before they do their sums and decide whether it's value or not. And how far down the road you are in designing it affects the amount of optimism bias the Green Book will add to it.
Thank you very much for that.
That still doesn't explain why it's always more expensive.
Actually, it's an interesting question whether the Clerk of Public Works was a part of government that we should miss.
Well, if you wanted to, you could actually spend a fruitful hour or two pursuing the restoration and renewal project for this complex of buildings to see whether they're applying sensible costings to it.
Well, can I just, before we move to our final question of this session, because we've had so many questions in about how stuff is calculated and how do you get to the bottom of this. When it comes to big areas of expenditure, Treasury Select Committee should be surely looking at those kind of the basis of those calculations and trying to get to the calculations behind the numbers.
I think that's broadly correct, but just as a clarification of what the Select Committee does, it's quite a funny committee because the Treasury is often at the centre of so many interdepartmental decisions. The Treasury signs off on final funding allocations for a range of projects across all of the other departments, and in a way it's a hub department. In general, it's our sister committees in those departments that look at the projects that are being proposed.
Right, okay.
And what the Treasury Committee does more of is, I think, looking at the institutions that the Treasury, that come under the Treasury, and also that the Treasury is
HMRC and so forth. Yeah, okay,
exactly.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you. Public Accounts Committee is, as the clerk has reminded me, is the one we should be talking to, and perhaps that's for another evidence session. We have now our final question of this session from David Hastings, who is a keen motorcyclist from Dumfries.
When it was called road tax, it was used on road maintenance. So why is vehicle excise duty not spent on road maintenance? I ride a bike on a daily basis, but so many roads, especially in rural areas where I live, are dangerous. How would a committee collect and review evidence on issues such as this, and are you provided with data?
Lord Moylan, I think that question is for you.
Although it was called road tax, it was never actually dedicated or hypothecated to expenditure on road maintenance. That was the fiction under which it was marketed when it was first introduced as a tax. But the government doesn't actually have hypothecation of any expenditure. It has one fund. National insurance is different, but for everything else, it has one fund called the Consolidated Fund, and any tax it collects goes into that fund, and provided it has parliamentary support, it can spend that money on whatever is approved through the budgetary process in the Finance Act. So it never actually worked like that. The principle behind road maintenance is that the local highways authority is in principle responsible for maintaining the local highway, not the motorways and the very main roads, but the local highways. The difficulty is that over the last few years in particular, the amount of local authority budget consumed, particularly by adult social care, is now consuming so much of local authority budgets that there's very little left over for things like maintaining road surfaces and so on. So what has happened is the government has stepped in periodically with dedicated grants. We've announced the day that there'll be X million to be spent on potholes. Every government does this from time to time. It's not party political, they all do it. And then it's a certain amount, but it's never quite enough. And it's because, in a way, the system of local government financing has ceased to bear what might be called a proper and proportionate relationship to the activities and responsibilities of local government. So that it's now constantly on drip feed when it comes to highways matters, and it never seems to be quite enough. I do understand the problem of potholes. They are
potholes.
It is manifest. I mean, if you drive a car or have a motorbike, it is manifest that how the surface of the roads has deteriorated in once you get off the Highways England roads, how the ones maintained by the local highways authorities, it's almost as if they'd stopped caring.
And this question concerned rural areas in particular, and I think we had a number of questions throughout the afternoon that have shown that there is a really serious concern among the public that rural areas are being omitted from policy focus in a whole number of different areas. Well, that brings us to the end of our final evidence session. I hope that members of the public who've joined us online through the live feed on Parliament TV, which I believe will be watched again and again if you wish to, and those that have come all the way here from all over the UK and from money saving expert Mumsnet and Shout Out UK, thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you, I'm sure that you have thought of 3 more questions, having listened to the answers to yours today and all those that came and presented earlier on. But I hope you're convinced that it's worth pursuing questions with Parliament, with MPs, looking at committee hearings and opportunities to put in evidence. I hope that the MPs and peers that have been before us through our 3 hearings today are convinced for their part that the public really do care about evidence, about the idea that stuff adds up, and what the thinking is behind the numbers, and that you'll feel compelled to come along to some of the evidence briefings, the rapid fire evidence briefings that are happening on cutting edge research in the Jubilee Room over the next 2 days. Certainly many of your staff have already signed up to the training on AI, survey data and many other subjects, cutting edge subjects that are going on. But thank you very much indeed for joining us for this panel. Thank you once again to the parliamentary staff who have supported us, particularly to the clerk of this committee who has enabled everything to run smoothly today. So very much thanks to you and indeed to the broadcasters who've stuck with us and zooming around the room. Thank you, and we look forward to further discussion in a reception after this session. I bring to a close this order.